Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Again, my name is Noah Burke. I'm from Wilson and Company. We are a sub-consultant on this project with New Mexico Department of Transportation and High Street Consulting. Today, this presentation will be for District 2, and it's our public engagement meeting having to do with the New Mexico electric vehicle infrastructure. Just a few items of housekeeping before we get started. So we wanted to just go over a few ways that you can ask questions, that you can reach us as panelists for the members who are in attendees. The chat icon can be accessed at the bottom of your screen. As you can see on this, it's you can click there, you can chat, you can ask questions or enter your email, etc. through that. Polls will take place throughout throughout the meeting and will be shown automatically, but can also be accessed via the polls icon, which is also down at the bottom. We ask you to hold your questions to the end, but we'll be able to answer them in real time. But the questions can be submitted for a question using the Q&A function at the bottom, and we'll be answering those questions as well. I'd like to introduce Angelica Bryant, who's also from Wilson and Company. She will be doing the Spanish translation today, and that's available by clicking the closed caption or interpretation icon on the bottom of the screen. So with that, I'd like to hand this over to Damon, my colleague.
Great, thanks so much, Noah, and welcome to everyone that's joined us here tonight. My name is Damon Fordham. I'm with High Street Consulting, and I'm leading the consultant team that's supporting the New Mexico DOT to develop this plan. With me tonight is Carrie Giles from ICF, who's also on the consultant team, and we'll be presenting together some information and then helping to answer questions along with our New Mexico DOT colleagues. This is the second of 6 public meetings that are informing the development of the New Mexico DOT NEVI plan, or National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Plan. And each meeting covers similar content. We had the first meeting for District 1 on Tuesday, this meeting is focused on District 2, but each meeting covers similar content. So there's just a little bit of distinction between some of the district level information. This slide shows the agenda. So after we do some introductions, we'll talk a little bit about the context for electric vehicle planning in New Mexico. We'll talk about the NEVI program, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, and some of the requirements in that federal funding initiative. We'll look at where existing electric vehicle chargers are right now in the state. And along the way, we'll do some polls, and then we'll also answer any questions at the end of the meeting verbally. Again, as Noah said, questions can be submitted using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And you can also use the chat function to chat with other participants or send a message directly to hosts and panelists. If you'd like to send us your email addresses so that we can make a note of those and keep you informed of any future information, you can put your email address into that chat box now as we do our introductions. If you do it just to the hosts and panelists, it'll just come to us, and then we'll add you to our distribution list. So we're planning to be together a little bit fewer folks on the line tonight. So we've scheduled for up to 90 minutes. We may not take that long, but we're happy to be here to answer your questions and have a good dialogue. Very happy that you're here. So with that, we can go to the next slide, and I would invite our New Mexico DOT project team to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Damon. My name is Jerry Valdez, Executive Director, New Mexico Department of Transportation, and I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight to discuss this very important topic. I am happy that you've taken time out of your day to listen to our presentation and to understand what our goals and our objectives are as we're moving towards electrifying New Mexico through NEVI funding. I will ask my team and my sister agency participants to take time to introduce themselves as well. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Montoya. I'm the program director with the New Mexico Department of Transportation regarding the NEVI funds and the statewide implementation plan. We are very excited to have you here with us tonight. We appreciate your time with us this evening, and we look forward to your input as we move forward with our implementation plan to make sure that we are covering all the motoring needs of the state of New Mexico. Mr. Leonard Manzanares, who is also part of our EV team here at NMDOT, is actually out in the field today looking at sites, so he will not be able to join us this evening. But again, welcome everyone. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to a productive public presentation.
And I would ask that Mary Jane Parks from our sister agency over at PRC take a moment to introduce herself as well.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. Hi, everybody. My name is Mary Jane Parks, and I'm a U.S. Department of Energy solar innovator that's helping the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission on transportation electrification. Chair Joseph Maestas has worked with the utilities on developing their transportation electrification plans, which were approved between 3 and 6 months ago. So we look forward to working with NMDOT on this project.
Thank you, Mary Jane. As well, from our sister agency, Ms. Nidra Murphy.
Hey, this is Nidra Murphy. Thanks, Jerry. And I apologize for my voice. I'm a little under the weather, so I might sound a little crackly, but I am here. Thank goodness for virtual meetings, right? I am with Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. And I am the alternative fuels and alternative transportation clean energy manager. I am so happy that we're doing these public meetings. I'm definitely happy to help answer questions wherever I can. Yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Damon?
Thanks so much, Jerry, and all the folks on the line. Great to have the collaboration across the state government. So this slide will come up again at the end, but I wanted to put it up at the beginning here as well in case anybody has to drop off. We really would love everyone to take the survey that we've developed. This survey is intended to get input back from the general public about this EV plan. And so the QR code up on the screen there, you can hold your cell phone up to that QR code on your screen and should be able to take a snapshot and link directly to that survey as we're presenting here. And we'll also put the link to the survey. Someone on the team maybe can drop in the link to that survey in the chat box while we speak, so that you have that link. And we would encourage you to send that out, far and wide to your friends and colleagues and family members, so that we can get as much input as we can from folks across the state. Second, if you have any questions or ideas after the meeting, we would invite you to send them to the email address there on the screen, nmdot.neviplan@state.nm.us. And someone is monitoring that email address and taking careful documentation of all the input that comes in through that mechanism. We also have a project website that went live a few days ago, so it's relatively new. And there is content on that website now, and we'll be updating the website as the project progresses, and we're working through the plan development over the next 6 weeks or so here. Again, if you want to give us your email address for us to contact you in the future, you can drop that into the chat box, and we are compiling email addresses so we have a good distribution list for future communications. Okay, well, with that, we can move to the next slide. And this is our first poll. So it's just kind of a practice for how the poll system works here. In a second, a dialog box will pop up on your screen, and you can enter in your zip code, just the 5 digits of your zip code. And what we'll do is we'll compile all those from the public meeting so that we can get a sense of who's participated across the state during these public meetings. So I'll give folks a second to answer that. right. These are not mandatory polls, but any responses that come in are helpful. So once everyone's managed to fill that in, we can close that one out, Noah. All right, so the results for that one don't pop up because that's an open field response, but for some of the future polls, we'll be able to see the responses as we move through. So we can move to the next slide and then probably just immediately again to the next one. We wanted to talk a little bit about the EV planning context in the state. So EV, again, is electric vehicles. When we're talking about electric vehicles, we're talking about vehicles that have no internal combustion engine. They don't use traditional combustion fuels like gasoline and diesel. All of the energy to power the motor comes from the battery in the vehicle, and they need to be charged. They need to be charged by plugging the vehicle into a power source, a charger. And often folks with EVs will do that overnight at their home or maybe at their workplace. But for folks taking longer trips between cities, long distances, or interstate travel, there needs to be access to publicly accessible charging stations, and that helps to make sure that the range of these vehicles is just like the range of any other vehicle that might need to pull into a gas station. So that's what we're talking about here today. We're talking about publicly accessible charging stations that are located along highway rights of way for people that to use to charge their vehicles relatively quickly when they're away from their home or workplace or other locations. Next slide. This gives some of the kind of context for climate change and electric vehicle efforts in the state. Obviously, at the national level, there's a lot going on, both for electric vehicles and in trying to respond to the issue of climate change. At the federal level, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or also called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that was the big federal legislation on infrastructure that passed recently. That's part of what brings us here today. And we'll touch on that in a few slides because that was the legislation that created this NEVI program. But there's also a lot that's been happening in the state of New Mexico. In 2019, the governor signed an executive order that committed New Mexico to the Paris agreements and also established a climate action priority in the state. And that executive order set a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030. And then subsequent work identified transportation electrification as a key strategy. Also in 2019, the state passed the Energy Transition Act that required investor-owned utilities to produce 100% carbon-free electricity by 2045. And then the state also began to distribute funds from the Volkswagen settlement. For folks that are aware of that, that was the fine and the settlement, legal settlement that the Volkswagen company went through that created funding to help states reduce transportation emissions. And New Mexico received some of those funds that's helped to put charges out across the state. In recent years, the New Mexico Environment Department have been hard at work distributing those funds to qualified projects and also leading a process for clean car rules, which were adopted earlier this month. So there's a lot going on in New Mexico. You can go to the next slide. The clean car rule and the NEVI plan help to reduce transportation emissions. Transportation is the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in New Mexico, but nationally it's the highest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and most of those emissions come from the combustion of fossil fuels. So the work that New Mexico DOT is doing on this NEVI plan is joining with other efforts that the DOT is taking to address climate change. The DOT is actively working to build a climate change program that's going to address resiliency planning to help make the state's transportation infrastructure more resilient to extreme weather and other hazards. Also, the agency's developing carbon reduction strategies, implementing multimodal plans and active transportation plans, and updating their own facilities with energy efficiency technologies and solar. And there'll be other efforts in the works as well moving forward, and likely additional public meetings and stakeholder input opportunities. So stay tuned for those. The next slide shows a map, and these green blobs here on the map are essentially where EVs are currently located in the state. These are zip codes that have more than 100 electric vehicles, pure battery electric vehicles that we've been talking about, registered in those zip codes. And so these areas sort of represent the early adopters, the early adopter areas. And as we see EV adoption growing through the state, it's likely to kind of grow out from these areas. Another piece of context we wanted to show was the existing volumes of traffic in the state on the major roadways. And so you can kind of see from this map that the width of the line there on the road shows how busy the road is. And some of the busiest areas are on I-10 down in the south, from sort of El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, and back and forth into Arizona. Then east and west across the middle of the state on I-40. And then on I-25, between Albuquerque and Santa Fe there and up to Espanola and Los Alamos. And then a little bit in the northwest corner there around Farmington and Bloomfield and Aztec. So that just got to give you a sense of existing traffic volumes and where the main travel corridors are as of today for all vehicles in the state. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Carrie, and she'll talk a little bit about NEVI and some of the requirements in NEVI that we're working with as we're writing this plan.
Good evening, everyone. So just to begin, I'll just move right into the next slide. So as Damon already mentioned, this funding is coming from the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed last year. What we're trying to do for New Mexico is look not just at what needs to be done for the NEVI program, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program, which is under the bipartisan infrastructure law. Sorry, there's a lot of acronyms and long titles here. But we're also looking to find out what else can be done in the electric vehicle landscape to take advantage of other competitive electric vehicle programs to be released later this year, as well as just plan out the larger strategy for New Mexico in general for the incoming market shift into electric vehicles. So of this, 5 billion of 7.5 billion that was allocated for electric vehicles under the infrastructure law. Of that 5 billion for the NEVI program, it's a portion via Federal Highway Administration funds. So basically, why it's called a formula program is it's the formula that's used to fund the highways is then determined to find out how much of that 5 billion every state gets. So New Mexico will receive approximately 38 million over 5 years for this NEVI program. So this is the guaranteed funds separate from additional competitive funds that, as I mentioned, they can apply for later this year. So if you go to next slide. So then specifically for the NEVI program, these funds are formula programs to be distributed to states to just strategically deploy DC fast chargers, so level 3 electric vehicle chargers, as some people like to refer to them as, to create an interconnected network both nationwide and across the state. So the goal of this is to make charging convenient, reliable, affordable, and equitable. There are different requirements that we'll go into here in a moment just about equity considerations. We don't want this to be a charging network just for the early adopters who've been able to afford electric vehicles to date. The market is shifting rapidly with lots of introductions of new makes and models of vehicles, as well as lower priced makes and models of vehicles once we're out of this wonderful supply chain issue that we're dealing with right now, where we can't get any vehicles at the moment. But it's anticipated that the market prices will be dropping dramatically. Now we've got trucks, we've got SUVs, we've got Jeeps, we've got medium and heavy duty electric vehicle. It's a much larger variety out there than it has in the past. So we do know the market is shifting. And upon plan approval, which we have to have a plan that we're talking about here tonight. Upon that approval, New Mexico will receive approximately 5.8 million for the first year of funding. The funding is federally appropriated year by year. So for the first year, we're talking about 5.8 million. And this funding is to purchase, install, own, and maintain electric vehicle charging stations. So this is not just a program to do put them in the ground and hope for the best. This is to put them in the ground and actually make sure they're being maintained. There's strict requirements for how available the stations have to be. They have to be available 97% of the time. There's all sorts of parameters that we'll talk about briefly here that are part of this plan. So the initial funding will be directed to designated alternative fuel corridors. These are corridors that New Mexico DOT has designated to the Federal Highway Administration that are electric vehicle ready or electric vehicle pending, which means that they've had electric vehicle installations in the past. However, we will be working to see how many of those electric vehicle installations are actually relevant as part of the plan, which we'll talk about here in a moment. So if you go to the next slide, please. So the timeline for this is rather compressed. If you see here, the infrastructure law passed in November of last year. The NEVI guidance, the initial guidance, about 30 pages, including an outline and a little bit of what the program can fund, who should be involved, some of the different requirements and chapters, which we'll get into a moment. That was released in February of this year. And we're currently anticipating the standards and requirements. It's called the 180-day standards for those who love the technical names. Those are meant to come out at any day now, essentially. They're anticipated out this month, and that has a lot of the technical details that we are still waiting for the program. Some of the very nuanced questions that the states have been giving to the US DOT over the past several months. Lots of other details. So once that comes out, which should be in the middle of this public meeting process, we will hopefully have some updates there as to what other requirements, what other interesting programs, what other nuances that we need to follow, and that might shift some of this planning. So we are keeping a flexible timeline here. And as you can see right now, we're in basically the public stakeholder engagement process and plan development. These plans are actually due to US DOT, to what's called the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation on August 1st. These plans are considered the first of 5 years of plans. Since it's a 5-year program, these plans will have to be updated every single year. Because these plans are subject to different political guidance, to best practices, to an evolving market, it is anticipated that this plan that's created now will not be the set in stone plan for the next 5 years, that, you know, public involvement, public feedback, all of those different requirements I just listed, they will be taken into consideration, and the plans will have to be updated and resubmitted every year to the joint office before the next funding tranche is released from the federal government. So just know that while this is a very compressed timeline right now, this timeline is really a 5-year timeline in the grand scheme of things. So the plans that we're developing now, the initial round of plans, will be delivered August 1st, and review from the Joint Office and from FHWA will be received by September 30th. And then, assuming the plans are approved, funds will be available for investment. This plan, or these timeline is what every state in the country is going through right now. It's not unique to New Mexico, but we are working with the other states to try to find out, you know, what some of the best practices and guidance are. So trying to find out exactly what other people have learned from other funding programs in the past, but also then trying to truly cater it to New Mexico to find out, you know, what we can do unique to the state to really make sure that we are reaching those equity components. So we are trying to get into every corner of the state. And as I said, not just for those who've been able to afford electric vehicles in the past. Although we love our early adopters and they're going to be probably the first users of these stations, we want to make this for all New Mexicans. If you go to the next slide. So what I was mentioning about the plan components and the guidance that came out back in February, there are essentially different chapters that we have to write about in the plan. An introduction, state agency coordination, what's happening with the other state agencies in the state, how this affects air quality, how this affects Volkswagen funds, how this affects other state programs that Damon talked about before. That all must be included. Public engagement, we are hosting, this is the second of what will be 6 public engagement meetings. We're reaching out directly, and we'll continue to reach out to the utilities in the state and some of the other key stakeholders to really make sure that everyone's voice is heard. And as you saw from the link in the beginning and also in the chat, there is another public survey as well, just to collect some additional information, and that email address where we're taking comments at any point in time. We are developing a vision and goals for what New Mexico wants to see. Please keep in mind that the NEVI requirements from the federal government are really just a structure and the minimal requirements. Those can then be customized, and additional requirements, additional goals, additional needs from the state can be included in this plan to truly make it a plan for New Mexico and not just a plan that checks off the federal guideline boxes. As part of this, you'll see contracting, implementation, some of the program evaluation. Those are different chapters on how the state will actually deliver the funds to those who are going to be doing the owning and installation of the stations, how they will work to make sure that it's implemented correctly, how the operation and the maintenance is done, and then how that's evaluated to make sure that they're meeting, all the stations are meeting the requirements and are available, as well as some of the pricing considerations of the stations. There's existing and future conditions. So that's something that Damien will discuss in a little bit as well as to what some of the existing infrastructure is. The catches for this, that the existing infrastructure might not meet the infrastructure requirements for the NEVI program, which I'll go through in a moment. So we do know that despite the fact that we'll be seeing roads that have electric vehicle charging stations already located on them, those might not count towards this requirement. So I'll get into those in just a moment. That's as well as the EV charging infrastructure deployment, how the state plans to prioritize and deploy stations, whether that's, what corridors it's supposed to be that the interstate corridors are prioritized, but beyond that, it's open to the state to interpret how those funds will be released. So that'll be a portion of the plan. Civil rights and equity are a huge portion of this plan, especially with the federal government's Justice 40 initiative. The goal of that program is for 40% of federal funding to be going to equity communities, but there's different ways that that can be interpreted, which I will go through again in a moment. Labor and workforce. We do know that the goal of this bill, this larger bill that was passed, was the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act. It's meant to create jobs. It's meant to create local jobs, to be able to train technicians and installers, and those people are coming out and doing the landscaping, the lighting, every component of what goes into a charging station is meant to help create those jobs, especially locally, for operating and then maintaining, as well as obviously the installation of these charging stations. So there is a workforce development component in here. And then also there are cybersecurity components, which is pretty self-explanatory there, to make sure the stations are up all the time and that everything's secure if we're doing a financial transaction. And then there's a chapter on discretionary exceptions. That would be if the state has any programs that they want to do that don't meet the NEVI requirements, we're allowed to apply and to get permission to try to do those. So to be determined what those might be as we wait for the detailed 180-day guidance. If you go to the next slide, the justice and equity considerations, as I mentioned, there's the Justice 40 program. It goes beyond simply identifying the income and education levels, which many people have used as socioeconomic basic levels to determine what a disadvantaged community is. We want to not only look at those, but then also look at some of these other factors, as you see down the left side in English or the right in Spanish. Climate change risk, traffic proximity. If someone is living along the highway, they're getting all the horrible exhaust and all of those emissions directly from the highway. So an equity consideration there could be the fact that if the person living against the highway, maybe they use mass transit, maybe they don't need a vehicle, they don't need to buy an electric vehicle, or right now socioeconomically they're not able to. What if we can at least get the vehicles on the highway to be cleaner so they have less emissions in their home? There's different considerations such as that. Wastewater, other pollution, prevalence of asthma. So it's really looking at some of the different health issues, and then just energy burdens and linguistic isolation, unemployment, and poverty. So many of these are items that people actively think about when they're looking at equity components, but really here, there's some federal tools that we're able to use and actually look on GIS maps exactly where the communities are that have all of these different burdens and justice issues that we want to make sure we're addressing. So it's not simply, as I said, getting people into electric vehicles. There's all sorts of additional components that we're looking at when we think of justice and equity with this program. I think you just go to the next slide. So when I mentioned before that we have a ton of electric vehicle charging stations already in New Mexico, however, they might not count, it's because there are some strict requirements for this program as to what has to be built out with the funding. So there, along the interstate highway systems, those that have been designated as corridors, there needs to be charging stations every 50 miles, and they need to be within 1 travel mile of the interstate. So as soon as you get on the exit ramp, they need to be within 1 mile of that. We can't have a 2-mile exit ramp and then another couple miles of travel. It has to be right off the interstate and convenient, because essentially what the federal government is trying to do here when they talked about convenience and a program that everyone understands and knows how to use, is they want something to basically replicate the convenience of gas stations. So as part of that, the charger requirements are a bit different than simply what we used in the past to say, hey, this is an electric vehicle alternative fuel corridor. There has to be 4 direct current or DC fast chargers, so 4 level 3 chargers with CCS ports. So it's just the type of charging plug that are actually capable of charging 4 vehicles at a time. So we can't have one 150 kilowatt charger that just happens to have 4 plugs and they all share that power load. This is a much higher power load. This is a bank basically of charging stations that if you're pulling in, you're not gonna have to wait 10, 15 minutes for the person in front of you to charge up and go, that you'll probably hopefully be able to pull right in and immediately begin to charge. Also some great redundancy if something happens with one of the stations, that there's others available. So because of this, many of the stations that Damon will show you here when we look at our existing conditions might not count towards these requirements. So these stations are either going to have to be upgraded, or we're going to have to look at how we can fill in around these stations and have these be supplementary stations to what the NEVI plan requirements are. So essentially, there's a lot of work to be done. And if you go to the next slide, I'll show you just an example. So these colorful highways that you see are the portions that have been designated by New Mexico DOT and approved by FHWA as alternative fuel corridors for electric vehicles within the state. As we mentioned before, the interstate corridors, those shown in purple, are meant to have the priority funding, and then really to work though through whatever plan that New Mexico decides they want to implement on how to distribute and prioritize the remaining. So if you can go to the next slide for District 2, specifically, we don't have here obviously any interstate corridors. So really trying to figure out exactly where charging stations, should be prioritized here. Where do we need to add in these stations to really get into District 2 to really begin to connect this district to the rest of the state with terms of electric vehicle charging stations? Again, it would have to be on those priority, those bold corridors shown, the state and US highways. But just because they're not technically interstate corridors and not the initial priority based on what the federal guidance says, doesn't mean that these aren't priorities for the state. The state is very keen on trying to make sure that we're getting to every single district and we're getting these fully distributed based on all of the requirements that we've talked about and all the feedback that is provided by the public. So what we're really trying to find out here is exactly where you think for your district, or you think for the state, where we truly need this charging and where and how we should prioritize it, because we are open to the public input as we try to create a fair and equitable program statewide. But with that, I will ask just for our polling purposes here, just we are intrigued if the poll pops up to know if you actually own an electric vehicle already, if you intend to own or operate an electric vehicle, or if you do not currently intend to own or operate an electric vehicle. Again, we're not trying to base these where all of the electric vehicles are, but we are trying to see if perhaps someone needs a charging station because right now they might not purchase or own an electric vehicle because they don't have that access. And just while you're filling out that poll, as we mentioned, this is just the corridor program. There are those other competitive programs. There are other federal programs that are still available for funding and other areas where we know as we work on an electric vehicle plan for the state that aren't just on the highways. Some of those other federal fundings specifically target schools, community parks, and other community locations, other routes. Right now, we do know that, getting into multi-unit dwellings, getting into our apartments, getting into workplace are other key considerations to truly create an electric vehicle program within the state. So just because we're not talking about them here for the federal does not mean that we are ignoring those considerations. But if we have all the polls answered, you just see right now we have one of our pulleys. We have 1 that own an electric vehicle and 3 that are hoping to own or operate or to lease an electric vehicle in the future. But with that, I will turn it over to Damon to talk about some of those existing EV charger conditions.
Great. Thanks so much, Carrie. So this map here shows the oat fuel corridors that Carrie introduced earlier. And then the little blue flags, the little blue dots there, are the existing EV chargers that are publicly accessible and are available for public use across New Mexico. There's 178 of those right now. That data comes from the Department of Energy's Oat Fuel Data Center, and they're verified EV charging stations. But that includes all stations that are publicly accessible. So they may be level 1 or level 2 or DC fast chargers. They include Tesla stations, which have a proprietary connector, which not all non-Tesla vehicles at the current time can't use. So that's kind of the current state of affairs in terms of publicly accessible EV charging stations in the state. And the next slide just zeroes in a little bit there on District 2. So there's a level 2 charger at the Otero County Electric Co-op near Alamo Gordo. There's Tesla chargers at hotels in Ruidoso, and there is a level 2 charger at hotels near Clovis. So that's kind of the current state of things. And right now, none of those are NEVI compliant chargers. So they don't meet those requirements that Carrie talked about in terms of the connector type or the distance from the highway or the charging capacity or the other requirements in NEVI. Now that doesn't mean that some of those may be able to be upgraded or otherwise, sort of retrofitted to become compliant. We haven't done that analysis yet, but as of right now, there's no NEVI compliant chargers in District 2. And then on the next slide, this is statewide. These are the NEVI compliant chargers statewide right now, and there are 8 of those. So these are ones that have that CCS connector type, that they're DC fast chargers. It's certain, able to provide a certain amount of power, certain charging capacity, with 4 ports and within 1 mile of the interstate and publicly available 24 hours a day. And the next slide is just essentially the same data, but just with the distances highlighted in bright green there. So kind of a 25-mile radius around each dot produces those bright green lines. And so it sort of shows the gaps that currently exist along those oat fuel corridors. So with that, we can go to another poll. And this poll is asking for feedback on the types of locations where you think that the state should prioritize publicly accessible charging stations. So as that poll pops up, we invite you to select up to 3. So just select the top 3 that you think are most important for where publicly accessible charging stations should be located. So we've got interstate highways, we've got high existing traffic volumes, we've got gaps in the existing network, we have rural areas, we have cities and urban areas, tourism destinations, disadvantaged communities or other communities. So we'll just give you a minute or so to fill in the poll and check off up to 3 of those that you think are the most important. While folks are doing that, I see a comment came in about a charging station in Roswell at the McDonald's. So the data we have used is the sort of verified data from the Oat Fuel Data Center, which is run by the U.S. Department of Energy, and I believe they have to verify stations, and there's a process for that. So it could be that their data is a little bit lagging what's actually on the ground. Obviously, the landscape is changing quickly. So I don't know how new that one might be, but that was not one that was in the Oat Fuel Data Center data set in any case. All right, so we've got a few people participating here. And we'll also make note of the input here on on those stations. And I noticed someone mentioned the PlugShare app. We can also kind of do some correlation between other data sets like that PlugShare data set with the Oakville Data Center as well. All right, we can probably go ahead and close out that poll. Let's see. So sort of even, somewhat evenly distributed responses. So interstates, corridors with high traffic volumes, rural areas, and tourism areas. Those were the kind of the highest ones from the responses. Some response around gaps in the network. So that's super helpful. For each of the public meetings, we have the same poll questions, so we can kind of aggregate all of the responses that come back across all the public meetings. Next slide has another poll. And when that one pops up, this is asking for the amenities that you think are needed at publicly accessible EV charging stations. We're inviting folks to select up to 5 of the most important amenities. So lighting, restrooms, shade, shelter, food and beverage, being accessible 24 hours a day, having someone on site, a customer service agent or another individual on site, having retail shopping available, and being safe and secure, or other amenities. So I invite you to select up to 5 of those. All right, I think we've got our participation there. So top selections on that one are lighting, restrooms, and 24-hour access. So lighting, restrooms, 24 hours access, and then slightly behind, shade, shelter, food and beverage, and safe and secure. So that's great. That's great input. All right. And then one last poll, which is a kind of an open question poll, which is just to invite you to type in areas where you believe charges are needed. They may be in District 2, in that southeastern part of sort of quadrant of the state, but it could be in other districts too. You don't have to limit it to District 2. And just type in anything. It could be a city name, it could be a county, it could be a pueblo, it could be a national park area, other type of community facility. So just interested in any ideas you have for where charges may be needed. All right, we'll do another 10 or 15 seconds. All right, we're probably good on that one. All right, so thanks for all that poll input. That's very helpful. And some of those questions are similar to the questions that we asked in the survey. Again, the link for that survey is in the chat box, and we'll also put the QR code up here again in a second for folks. So what's next after these public meetings? Again, this is the second of 6 we're doing, and we're also doing a lot of stakeholder engagement with folks, private sector parties that are involved in EV charging, with utilities, with local governments, with advocacy and nonprofit groups. So we're engaging stakeholders in various ways. We're also gathering relevant data, and we're putting that into a GIS platform and doing some spatial analysis. So when we've done all that, that'll all feed into the development of the plan. And again, as Carrie mentioned, that the plan is intended to meet the requirements of the NEVI formula program funding, so that the state can get its portion of those that federal formula program funds. But it's also intended to inform future development of publicly accessible charging across the state using other funding streams as well. So all of this input, even if it's not a charging station that may be able to be funded through NEVI, if it's a community charger or a level 2 that's needed somewhere, that could be funded in different mechanism. And this NEVI plan will help to kind of put a plan in place to do that. So we'll leverage this formula funding through NEVI, other funds, state and federal funds, and really start to put out over the coming years that convenient, accessible, equitable network of charging stations across the state. And with that, I think we can open up the Q&A. Now, we don't have quite so many folks on the line today, so I think we can probably do any questions verbally if people want to actually speak and engage with us. We also welcome written questions through the Q&A box at the bottom there. Just click on that and submit a question. But if you'd like, you can just raise your hand, and at the bottom there, there's a button to raise your hand. You can raise your hand. We'll unmute you, and you can just speak your question to us, and we can have a dialogue if that is of interest. Let's give folks a second to find their way down there to the Q&A box or to the hand raise box. All right, we got one from Scott. Noah, are you able to unmute, Scott?
Yep. Just go ahead and, Scott, please click unmute and go ahead and speak.
Okay, this is Scott. You can hear me?
Yes, sir. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your work on creating EV charging infrastructure in New Mexico. How will this plan, or does it coordinate at all with existing charging networks such as Electrify America and others? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So we are busy pulling together all of the information that's available about those sort of existing and ongoing efforts. So what we've showed on the screen, is sort of our initial analysis of the readily available data that's out there for existing charging stations. But we're aware that there's been a lot of movement. There's a lot of plans in place. There are plans, Electrify America in particular, plans that for funding that was received through the VW settlement program for chargers that may not be in the ground yet, but that there is a plan in place to put them out there. So we're doing the best we can to engage with the relevant stakeholders, with the utilities, sister agencies, to make sure that as we're developing our GIS platform, that we're taking into account where there may be chargers coming online in the future. Another important component about the chargers that the state will be deploying through this program is, we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to facilitate interoperability, to facilitate the broadest possible public use of that network. So things like allowing for credit card payment and not restricting use to proprietary networks or apps is going to be important to make sure that the networks are available to as many people as possible, that the networks are talking to each other, that the networks are sharing the same kinds of data, so that we can really sort of see this as a comprehensive, consistent network across the state. So hopefully that answers your question. Feel free to for any follow-ups, and then my colleagues on the line may also have some responses.
And Scott, I'm currently actually cross-referencing the ones you had mentioned from PlugShare, the McDonald's and the other in Artesia. And I'm actually going to drop another link in the chat too. So if you ever see what the federal government's looking at for these requirements, are those stations that are located in the AFDC, which the Electrify Americas, which all the other programs are loading theirs into, because basically the federal government is cross-checking what's planned versus what's there to actually check off if we've completed these corridors. So I will just be loading I'm going to send these over to the AFDC as well to have their staff review these, but I just added a link there. So if you ever come across another station that you want New Mexico to get credit for, definitely feel free and spread the word to have them submit it there so that it shows up in the AFDC so that we can have at least one more checked off. And this is going to be, as part of the infrastructure law, this AFDC is basically supposed to become another plug share, where it shows you exactly when these stations, especially those funded by this program, are available, when they're not available, when they're down. So we want to make sure we're helping them get the information, and I sent it to the wrong one, as accurate as possible. And that is also because, like you said, those other networks that are installing charging are helping feed this in behind the scenes, so that hopefully, as we said, the plan will evolve every year so that we're not duplicating those efforts by the private companies, especially anything Volkswagen Fund, Electrify America, any of the other private entities out there that are going to be installing regardless of federal funding.
All right, great question. Appreciate that. I have a question that came into the chat box from Adrian Hedden at the Carlsberg Current Argus. So he mentions that New Mexico is highly dependent on fossil fuels and for its economy. And how does the state reconcile the economic impact of the industry with this effort to encourage vehicles that don't use fossil fuels and could be viewed as an obstacle to a major economic driver in the state? So I think I'm going to allow our colleagues at either the DOT or maybe NIDRA to take a stab at answering that one.
Yeah, this is Nidra. So I am actually going to let Jerry take first stab at this question and then follow up if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you, Nidra. And this is Jerry Valdez, the Executive Director at the Department of Transportation. And energy in any of its forms definitely lead to prosperity, to benefits and gains. And so with this program, what we're looking at is being able to utilize renewable energy as a way to enhance and address the climate issues that are facing not only the nation, but New Mexico as a whole. And so through our work here in the state of New Mexico and through the initiatives established through the governor's climate action initiatives, this is something that we're looking towards is a long-term solution to address these climate issues. And so, of course, as you mentioned, fossil fuel is still a driver of our economy. And this is a long-term vision that the state has to address its climate initiatives and goals set by the governor and the administration today. And so, Nidra, if you have anything to add to that, that would be wonderful, as well as Mary Jane, if she has anything from the energy perspective.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. I appreciate you heading that question off. And, you know, definitely oil and gas, fossil fuels has been a very important part of the economy. Don't deny that. But there are also other ways of driving the economy. And I think that's one of the reasons why the bill that was passed is driven at being a jobs, creating jobs, and it's focusing on it. It's called a Jobs Act. So I think that's definitely something, not just in New Mexico, but federally in the United States is definitely being considered. And it's not like it's going to change tomorrow and be gone tomorrow. I think it'll be more of a phasing into other opportunities, other economic opportunities in the state. And I will let someone else, if they want to fill in, go ahead.
Thank you, Nidra.
Mary Jane, did you want to add anything?
Well, you know, my colleagues answered it very well. I am with the PRC, and yes, oil and gas, as Nidra was saying, big economic driver for our economy in the past, but I think going forward, and especially actually over the last 20 years, energy efficiency has provided many more jobs per megawatt than traditional power. So from a electric utility standpoint, the job creation has really come with energy efficiency programs. And that encompasses all kinds of industries. I think oil and gas in the future will certainly be here and looking at how they can reduce their carbon footprint. And these stronger, powerful fuels would be utilized more for manufacturing, probably air transport, different industries that require very strong power in a short amount of time. But the vehicle, it's perfect use for electric transportation for our climate.
Great, thanks so much for. So glad we've got such a good kind of panel here to provide great responses. So I don't see, unless I'm missing anything, I don't see any other hands raised. I don't think I see any other questions open, and I don't think I see anything else in the chat box. So I think we're probably drawing close to a close here. Again, please do stay in touch. Anyone that has a mechanism to get the word out about this, Adrian, feel free to get the word out about the survey, about the mechanisms for contact, about the website. We definitely want to hear from as many people as we can in this short period of time here, and create a well-informed plan. So with that, I'll start to draw it to a close, and maybe Jerry, you'd like to close things out for us.
Thank you, Damon, and thank you for everyone who showed up tonight and participated. Again, this is very important that we hear the voice of our constituents, and your opinions and your feedback matter. And so thank you. There will be 4 additional sessions that we'll be conducting in the other districts. And so if there's anybody that may have had to miss tonight, please let them know there's more to come. Thank you.
All right, we'll end there. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us. Really appreciate you taking that time in your evening, and stay tuned, lots more to come, and we thank you for your input.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.